Namaste and good evening, everyone. I, Aditya Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti, Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my heartiest welcome to you all to IMPRI #ThePolishTalk. Today, we are here for a special talk on critical evaluation of gender mainstreaming efforts by the state. The speaker for today is Dr. Binitha V Thampi. The talk is being organized by Center for Human Dignity and Development at IMPRI, along with Center for Development, Communication and Studies at Jaipur and Counterview as part of the series, The State of Development Discourses, #Cohesive Development. I would now like to request Dr. Arjun Kumar, who is Director at IMPRI, to introduce our eminent panelists and speaker further. Sir, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika, and I welcome all of you for this very important discussion today under our series, The State of Development Discourses, #Cohesive Development, and the series is being moderated by Professor Sunil Ray. And the topic for today's discussion is critical evaluation of gender mainstreaming efforts by the state, and the speaker for today is Dr. Binitha V Thampi ma'am, who is Associate Professor of Development Studies at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, from Chennai. Welcome, ma'am. For other panelists of this discussion includes, of course, Professor Sunil Ray, who chairs this series. Sir was earlier former director of A.N. Sinha Institute at Patna, and sir is also advisor at CDECS, Jaipur, and also at IMPRI, Delhi. Both the organization come together for this series. For discussions, we are also joined by Dr. Anamika Priya Darshini ma'am, who is a research lead at the Sakshamaa initiative for What Works at Center for Catalyzing Change, also known as C3. We are also joined by Dr. Aditya Mohanty sir, who is assistant professor in development studies at Central University of South Bihar. So welcome everyone. With that, now I invite Professor Sunil Ray to give his opening remarks and to invite our speaker, Dr. Binitha Thampi ma'am, to give her lecture. So with that, Professor Sunil Ray, over to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Arjun. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to coordinate, to chair this session. And this is second, the series, which I feel proud of, that the fact that the series has been going on very well, is being picked up quite well. But only thing that before the presentation by Dr. Binitha on critical evaluation of gender mainstreaming efforts of the state that begins, let me remind Dr. Binitha and also the discussant, the background note which is being given by Dr. Arjun Kumar, where he clearly explained what the objective of this forum is all about, why this particular series of this kind is being launched. And let me tell you that he wants to, and which I felt excited about, he wants to make a difference between the presentations being made normally and here. The difference is that basically that you certain facts, figures, evidence are always being shared. Maybe any political, social, economic, geographic, any social science problem. But beyond that, it is expected in this forum, the presenter or the writer is capable of taking the audience, taking the people to a different level of abstraction, different level of understanding, or kind of insights he or she is able to bring about. Otherwise, what happens, you go on sharing the evidences. I am the observer. I am also going to add up and saying that, oh, this is missing, that is missing, if you would have done this and that. But eventually at the end of the day, or after the presentation is made, I ask the question, what are the insights? What is exactly going to take place? What is that you are trying to talk about? Here, what is called the question of paradigm comes. That means underlying theoretical construct has to be clearly explicit, has to be explicitly stated, has to be recognized. And if you really implicit paradigm you be critical of, of development. For example, here, there could be many more evidences, as I presume, that you suggest that the gender mainstreaming efforts of the state is something which are certainly not adequate, not only inadequate, but also is faulty. And therefore, there is a criticism against the government, given the state machinery, against the state intervention. Well, if that is the case, fine. But beyond that, what is the underlying paradigm of change? That is what is expected to be hinted at, because finally, this what this institute and Dr. Arjun Kumar are going to do, compile them and bring out a kind of what is called a new, at least outlining a different kind of a development paradigm that he can think about and all that, based on all these observations, based on all the presentations. Therefore, one should be slightly careful, and this is also my persuasion with the discussion, that what is missing in the presentation is something which one can always point out and dwell upon it. But then that is not enough. And then insights from Binitha's presentation, for example, Dr. Binitha's presentation, what are the insights coming up? And what are those insights will be able to really seek for what's called or justify an alternative perspective, development perspective. You know, that is what exactly alternative paradigm or alternative theoretical perspective is, something which is very much necessary for us to search for. That is what the assignment Dr. Arjun has given to us. And I think we should be able to really confirm, because otherwise, you know, as I want to remind you, I will stop here. I want to remind you that let us not further allow us to be victim of the machine of reproduction of knowledge. We are reproducing knowledge here, everywhere, same thing. And if I go back home and then say, well, what is that extra thing that I have been able to learn? And really, sincerely, if we think that in 90% cases, nothing. And we have been always becoming the victim of this kind of reproduction. Question is that now today, for every one of us, shall we stop it? Where to go? Exactly, that is the question that is Dr. Arjun is asking. And therefore, he is searching for some alternative paradigm of change, or demystifying the extant development paradigm. The demystification of extant development paradigm is looking forward to say something, so seek something more than what is to be done. Thank you so much. With these brief words, I would like to request Dr. Binitha to present her thesis on this gender mainstreaming efforts. Thank you so much. Thank you all, especially the discussant also for joining this program. And of course, the other participants who could be joining, and we do not know much about them, but then I will be really welcoming their contributions to this discourse. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. So, yes, Binitha ma'am, would you like to screen share? Yeah. Go to the full view. Yes, in the slideshow. Yeah. Perfect. Yes, please go ahead, ma'am.
Slides are visible, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So, good afternoon. Let me thank the organizers of this event, Impact and Policy Research Institute, and its director, Dr. Arjun Kumar, the chair of today's talk, Professor Sunil Ray, and other panelists. I'm very thankful to you all for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward for a very meaningful, engaging interaction after the presentation. Thank you all. Let me begin. This is a kind of compilation of various studies, including that of mine at the end. I'll explain how I structured today's presentation. One is, I think it's very important when we talk about mainstreaming, the history and context of claim making, how it happened over time. Two, the specific mainstreaming efforts globally that has been recognized, accepted as a result. Three, locating this within the context of a particular state, Kerala, that I'm familiar with, I've been researching. and to take a critical evaluation of those mainstreaming efforts. This is how I structure my presentation. Yeah, the history is a history, sometimes boring. We all know this, but I'm quickly going through them. Quite a lot of different notions and understanding after the World War II period on development, but also, as we know, there's a very, very consolidation of the idea of development. Modernization theories were proposed, which was by and large growth-oriented, proposed growth-oriented model of development. We know Rostov's Stages of Economic Growth, 1960 work. Interestingly, the title of the book is Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. We'll have to think about why that title, because it was proposing another parallel, perhaps a good schema of change from the traditional society to the age of high mass consumption. And it came from the history of primarily Europe and other locations. Expectation basically was trickle down of the benefits of the economic growth, but after the first 2 decades of development, 50s and 60s, there were unhappiness and criticisms that hardly any major trickle down actually visible. Poverty is continuing, malnutrition is there. So what's happening became another major concern. So there was a kind of critique of mainstream development, late 60s, early 70s, came out from various corners. As we know, dependency theorists, world system theories, if you look at from the broader left political spectrum, because the criticism for them was from the long-run development of capitalism and how unequal that was. Also environmental critique of development. This kind of growth-oriented mainstream development is bringing in major environmental destruction. That has to be addressed, and it's very, very unjust kind of, it's producing very unjust kind of development, and that's not humans are implicated within. The larger nature and animals and the entire ecology is part of this development process. Various kinds of criticism I'm summarizing. Along with this, women's question, women's criticism against mainstream development came out. So the question basically was exclusion of women from development. It started with that, and I'm mapping the politics of claim making. Started with perhaps women's role in economic development, the work, the well-cited important work by Esther Bosworth, in which she argued, I'm again summarizing the whole discussion, I'm summarizing, and summaries have its own problems. You can raise questions or add and explain later, but I'm providing basic summaries in which she argued, she brought in a connection between density of population and agriculture technology. She argued that locations where density is less, for instance, Africa, it is within shifting cultivation, whereas in Asia, South Asia, if you look at, it's plow cultivation. And she connected this difference in agriculture technology to the kind of conjugality, conjugal arrangement. Africa, hence its polygamy, women are primarily engaged in cultivation. They took charge of farming, whereas in Asia, where you find low cultivation, women became the subsidiary producers. They were supporting men by and large. They had limited control over the produce. So she connected this difference with the status, women's status in these locations, and argued how colonialism as a kind of practice very systematically either pushed women out of agriculture or made them, so they had no respect for female farming systems, and they pushed women out of agriculture or made them subsidiary farmers. This is very illuminating precisely because of the fact that she demonstrated with evidence the process of modernization is not that favorable to women. It's not including women in the process of production. A very systematic exclusion is taking place. As a result, a new approach in the 70s, women in development approach came out, argued for the integration of women in the development process. And then all kinds of celebration, it received wider acceptance, 75 year for women, 75, 85, the decade. And the very first World Women's Conference at 75 in Mexico City, it was very interesting for the reason that the question basically they deliberated was what embodies women's issues. And very clearly the differences came out. First world talked about equity question, symbolic equity as well, whereas the second world, the then USSR and allies talked about increasing militarism and the need for war and militarism and the need for bringing in peace and peaceful coexistence. Third world, interestingly, talked about the question of development. This, from this, there was a realization that women are not a uniform category. Differences are very visible, explicit. And from 50s to 70s, there was a welfare approach. If you look at in India, we had family planning program from 1951. Women were considered as passive recipients of development. Their reproductive role was acknowledged. But 70s, there is a shift from this welfare approach to equity approach. Because of all these grassroots mobilizations.
Clarity, clarity नहीं क्या ना बोलते एमनीते सिस्टम प्रॉब्लम ना.
So the equity approach in which equal opportunities and the rights of women were highlighted. And we had National Commission for Equal Employment Opportunity and also discussed our failure to address sexism and sex-based advertisements, for instance, educational opportunities and training that women require. So inclusion of women in various social and political forums was highlighted. And we had Equal Remuneration Act legislation in 1976. But 80s, the story again changed. There is a change from equity to efficiency in the 80s. And 80, the Copenhagen review meeting of that decade, 75, 80, 85, 3 meetings they had. And in the Copenhagen review meeting, the primary concern was global economic slowdown. And stabilization and adjustment policies were suggested during that time, cuts in welfare spending. As a result, the question became efficient development and realized women as a very crucial actors in this changed scenario because of their willingness to accept worse conditions of work and low wages. As a result, credit to women, supplementary income generation programs, micro enterprises, etc. have been proposed. Many national governments, aid agencies, and NGOs focus on these interventions. And 85 Nairobi conference wrapping up that decade was again interesting, in which third world, as not as a geography, as a category, not as just a location, as a category recognized, women's needs from the third world are different, particularly women in subsistence production, if you look at. Also, there were arguments that poor women, precisely because of their relationship with the natural resources, they are actually creating kind of damage to the environment. That has been, this is a question of rights, livelihood, right for a livelihood, so on and so forth. So that has also been debated to at greater length. Debt crisis was something several countries undergoing. Apartheid in South Africa. So they were, interestingly, the 85 conference was basically talking about unequal global structures and institutions within which women are operating and integrated. That was quite distinct. As a result, also, women and development approach came up from women in development to women and development. The criticism at a conceptual level, this was very useful analytically because they argued, well, you argue for integrating women in employment, but this integration is in a very, very exploitative manner, because two structures, capitalism and patriarchy, collaborate very effectively, and you call it as capitalist patriarchy, is exploiting women in a much more deep manner. Also, they talked about specificities of women's working lives. They engage in market production, biological reproduction, and social reproduction. And also, hence, there is a kind of multiplicity of tasks, labor time. And this criticism came from Global South. For instance, Geeta Sen from India was her very famous article with Lourdes Benaria, 82-83 paper. So women and development provided a more critical view on position of women. And hence it called for affirmative action by the state, such as maternity benefits and other kinds of benefits for women, because the market mechanism is actually worsening already existing inequalities. And then the empowerment paradigm of the late 80s, early 90s, it came from grassroots movements and their experience of mainstream development. We had Seva in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, Grameen Bank experiment, and several experiments. Also by then, CEDAW Convention against all forms of Convention on all forms of discrimination against women came into effect in 1981. And it provided a comprehensive framework to combat gender inequality, and recognizing that governments are responsible for not only putting appropriate laws in place, but also to monitor the impact of them. And 80s, 90s, late 80s, 90s, if you look at, empowerment became very popular. It was sort of, it's imagined, conceptualized as a process through which powerless gaining power, and also they unpacked this power box, in which argued there is different levels and stages. There is power 2, in the sense access and control over various kinds of resources, including knowledge. And power with meaning the kind of collectivities when women are together and negotiating with structures of patriarchy, it's much more effective. And power within is basically internal transformation that at the individual level and at the collective level, women should undergo, invoking their agency. And power over, at times, one group gaining power over another group, perhaps a temporary stage. So these were the kind of conceptualization, and also questioned the notion of women as a universal category. It talked about intersectionality, because there are various structures of various axes of social power, caste, class, ethnicity, so on and so forth. They interact and produce certain kinds of advantages and disadvantages for different groups of women that we need to be attentive to. Also, men and masculinity studies came up, in which argument basically was that, well, why do you talk only about women? Men, this structure is equally disadvantageous to men, and you don't see that. Why is it that farmer suicide, by and large, men are committing suicide? They have different kinds of issues. Their situation, the way in which patriarchy treat them is also unfair. So several studies demonstrating that, discussing that, also parallelly queer mobilization, LGBTQ, sexual minorities, sexual workers, so on and so forth. Hence, the terrain has significantly transformed. And now I am again summarizing the academic debates of these 2.5 decades from 70s to mid 90s. One is identifying male bias in social, political, and economic thinking and everyday actions, rationalizations and theorizations, which will have significant bearing on public policy making. Diane Nelson's paper, and even this male bias basically highlighting inequality and asymmetry, which is ill-founded and unjustified. Instead of judging biases against endowments and preferences, judge it in terms of rights and capabilities was Amartya Sen's contribution. Rights in terms of land rights and access to informal sector employment, so on and so forth, various. Along with that, socially comfort capabilities you should understand. And also, many biases intersect. Caste, region, urban, racial, ethnic, all these biases intersect. And impact of this in the public policy making is that the category production, such as farmers, workers, so on and so forth, is based on these biases that we are having. Also, they critique the household model, neoclassical household model, and joint utility function, which is including head of the household, despotic yet benevolent, has also been critiqued. Talked about cooperative conflict, the kind of bargaining that's taking place, and the weak fallback position that women are having, and also recognize agency of women. Winner of one round, enhanced bargaining power for future, 87 Amartya Sen's work. They also looked at caring work and reproductive labor, also inequality in expenditure decisions and spending, expenditure decisions and spending decisions. Summarizing, the realization was that development process may perpetuate inequality and collective action is required. Now coming to the gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming as a strategy formally adopted at the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, and it illuminates gender as a central element of thinking and acting and recognizes its role in power relation and institutions. There is an interesting study that I came across. Olena Handisky's 2005 paper, she's a political scientist, in which she actually carried out a feminist analysis of gender mainstreaming exercise. A very constructive set of criticism. I'm not going into the details of this paper, but she argued for a difference mainstreaming. Because there are differences, recognize and go for difference mainstreaming. broadly the kind of mainstreaming policies adopted were globally engendering macroeconomic policies, gender budgeting, gender-friendly taxation, so on and so forth, instituting quotas for women in governance, gender training to build awareness, so on and so forth. But this is taking place in a context of competing and conflicting interests. Because of the structural adjustment programs and other stabilization programs, there were austerity measures. At the same time, you had human rights framework and more consolidation of rights question and claim making. So this is happening in that kind of a global context. Now I am talking about briefly the Kerala mainstreaming efforts in the context of Kerala, so that I can, in the light of these context and specific mainstreaming, I'll elaborate, explain how in Kerala this has happened, and set of a couple of critical observations. So the gender mainstreaming efforts within decentralization campaigns, Kerala has started it. During the 9th plan period, it decided to for massive decentralization, 30 to 35% of the state budget devolved to the local governments. And they started a campaign in which gender mainstreaming was also considered. So this is partly due to the kind of feminist politics of claim making and questions around representation of women that was going on. And the feminist movement were active since 1980s. And it raised various questions of discrimination against women in the workplace, the sexual harassment issues that they discussed. They've been taking up such cases. Sorry. Yeah. Also, there was a debate on the invisibility of women in public spaces and demarcation of public spaces, gendered demarcation. There was a kind of debate going on. Also, I believe the role of women writers, several of them of body and sexuality also contributed to the debate. Literature is very, very powerful, especially to reach people and change their thinking. Also, parallelly, emergence of Dalit feminism and the question of marginalization that they experience, kind of challenging the caste, raising the caste question. Also, together, they all questioned the hegemonic feminine and masculine conceptions. I would dare to call it as sort of a counterculture movement, very unpopular even among the so-called progressive left circles, yet it was visible. And when you look at the empowerment, this is the context of Kerala. When you look at the empowerment paradigm of 90s, there is something called the emergence of, because of this mainstreaming and formal recognition, there is this emergence of state feminism. Because state is becoming more feminist or co-opting the feminist claims and demands. What happened basically was the kind of critical distance, much needed critical distance between the state and women's organizations reduced. I would say, compromised. Collaborators, and they became collaborators of several state initiatives. Mahila Samakya, self-help groups, program Kudumbashri, Gender Park, and several institutions they involved, collaborated. Also, if you look at specific mainstreaming efforts in the state where raising quotas at the PRIs to 50% on ground, if you look at more than 50, 52, 53% are women head of the village panchayats. Second, they organized self-help groups. The name of the program is Kudumbashri, and they linked it with Panchayati Raj, organically linked it with the Panchayati Raj institutions, and instituted a component plan, a specific component plan called Women Component Plan. 10% of the total outlay is set apart for women, in the sense exclusively for women beneficiaries. 4 massive gender training sessions were conducted. And in 2015, they formed to institutionalize all these efforts. They came up with Gender Park in 2015. Also announced same year transgender welfare policy. These are all part of the mainstreaming efforts. Now to the criticism, if you look at, as we know, quotas for women being heralded as an affirmative action, instituted in the spirit of gender equality in political representation, as we know, and they raised it to 50%. But studies have shown that most of the leaders, they had acquired knowledge and skills appropriate to elected office, but they had been unsuccessful in influencing change in their spheres of action, many of them, and were also subjected to patriarchal domination by male members of their own political parties. Also, evaluation of the participation in local governance revealed that while they are competent in their role as managers of development programs, they're far removed from local political institutions and associated power. So induction into local governing institutions is not translating into accessing neither local political institutions or helping them to get into higher levels of politics. So at the local level, hence, it seems to be a clear gender demarcation between governance and politics. Governance for women, they're better managers, but the actual politics for men. And the self-improve program, if you look at, I'm not going into the details of the way in which this program has been designed, but this is a kind of 3-tier confederated structure devised to effectively address poverty. More than half of the households are enrolled in this program, and they are linked with the local self-governing institutions, maybe functioning as a state-supported civil society, and they do savings and credit like any self-help groups, also micro enterprises. So engaging with the sub-state local government, if you look at, they undertake the Kudumbashri projects funded by the local panchayats. They also engage in identifying poverty, the survey that the government is doing. Also undertake MGNREGA work. But evaluation studies have pointed out that there is group-based exclusion from this program of laborers and women laborers and women from marginalized groups. Since this is a kind of formal anti-poverty program of the state, this exclusion has wider consequences. Because participation in these group exercise, group activities is mandated for accessing several of the benefits. And if you look at the impact on political agency, well, a new group of women social activists came up, but also in a sense subsidizing an overstretched state. Most of the work that they do is voluntary and sometimes a minimal honorarium. So the wider consequences of this form of managing poverty is narrowing the anti-poverty agenda on the one hand and hiding the cost of women's engagement on the other. So this women component plan, if you look at 10% of funds exclusively set apart for women beneficiaries as a separate plan component, attempting to address both the practical and strategic gender needs, they have to collectively identify locally specific gender needs. And that has to be an agenda for them. But scholars, Naila Kabir, before Nancy, not Nancy Faltry, scholars have pointed out that particularly
Fraser? Nancy Fraser, maybe?
Nancy Fraser. Nancy Fraser started it and Naila Kabir used it later. They talked about the politics of needs identification. Thank you, by the way. Women are actually not acting as a political constituency on ground to articulate their needs. So that's a major drawback. And several gender training programs. One of the key efforts towards empowerment has been the training workshops designed and implemented by the state level institutions like Kerala Institute of Local Administration in collaboration with women's organizations for the elected representatives in Panchayat and other local governance institutions. See, the problem basically is that the underlying assumption of these efforts has been that transformation to a gender just society is possible in a very non-confrontational manner through gender training and the development of individual skills as the principal tool of transformation. And focus on this gender training on individual transformation, in fact, precludes the coming together of women as a group to build solidarity based on their shared experiences. It also assumes a very hierarchical relationship between trainer and trainee. I worked as a gender trainer for some time in the same institution, and it projects, trainer as an embodiment of empowerment, insulated from the patriarchal power. And such a framework is not conducive for mutual exchange and learning, as well as the kind of horizontal networking among women from diverse backgrounds and dispersed geographies, which is very vital for any process of collective empowerment. So if you look at the training material, you will understand that it is a very, very top-down pedagogy that they adopted, even though it is participatory. So now, I'm not commenting on that gender park and transgender welfare policy that they instituted recently. Nothing much came out. One has to wait and see. So there is, now I'm wrapping up, rethinking state-led gender mainstreaming strategies. These mainstreaming policies have tended to assume automatic transformation on ground and have not taken cognizance of how the interventions interact with existing power structures and relations. And also mainstreaming has to be difference mainstreaming, like Olena Havinsky argued, addressing the question of intersectionality. Also, there is a need to engage with changing feminist politics of the location in the state of Kerala. And moving forward, hence, there are indications of reclaiming feminist politics from the state feminisms, moving away from the shadow of state feminism. There were Kiss of Love protest against moral policing of the right-wing group by a group of young men and women. Women in Cinema Collective, a group of women in cinema, popular mainstream film, they collectivized and they are voicing against anti-women attitudes in Malayalam film industry. Very interesting and very influential. Also young feminist voices of resistance in social media from various corners. So you could actually see kind of very interesting mobilizations and voices from the margin and from varied locations as well. So therefore, a very careful interrogation of the state-led gender mainstreaming effort itself is required to make it responsive to the context in which it works. Need to forge broader platforms of solidarity is essential. I'm stopping here. Thank you for your attention. And I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, ma'am, for a very elaborate and I would say very extensive presentation. I'm sure we'll have a very nice discussion with that. So, Professor Sunil Ray, would you like to start giving your comments? Professor Ray? I'll just check with sir. Anamika, ma'am, would you like to give your comments first? Yes. Please, I'll check with some connection issues.
Yeah, I guess so. I really wanted to hear Professor Ray and then go, but anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Binitha. It was indeed a very, very interesting presentation. I really liked it. I especially liked it because you emphasized so much about contextualization, and it was really good to see the way you started right from the Second World War and then talking about Bozarab and then going to the different frameworks of gender and development or women in development and approaches of mainstreaming gender. I think I also liked it because, you know, I'm very sure, I mean, I could sense while you were presenting that probably we are on the kind of same page. And you would agree with me that the mainstream mechanism is more interested in decontextualizing and ahistoricizing. I mean, if we look at departments like history or women's studies, especially in the West, the impact of this depoliticization or decontextualization or even ahistoricization is so devastating that in many schools, these departments are closing down. Women's studies are. I was a student of women's studies department back in 2006. I joined, and by the time I graduated, it had become global gender studies. So, because you know the market is not looking for graduates from women's studies, so it has to be something more appealing and more kind of interdisciplinary. But what I find scary, that I sense a disregard for history and even aversion for history, and even within academia, especially in interdisciplinary program like development studies. I know you are from development studies. I also have a master in international development. But you know that what is the context and what's the mainstream kind of, especially in policy studies. And sometimes I do feel that the experts and even scholars and academics from these coming out of these schools are probably suffering from history deficit. I should not be saying that, but your presentation really made me think about these questions, and I really thank you for raising this. Coming back to your the main point of your presentation, you discussed about raising the quota for reservation for women in local governing bodies. I work in Bihar. I'm from Bihar, and it happened to be the first state that announced 50% reservation for women in local governing bodies back in 2007. And so we have more than 50% women in local governing bodies. And I know I don't buy this entire idea of dummy representative or proxy representative. Yes, women were proxy representative, but then we need to question, what do you mean by dependent women? What do you mean by disempowered women? Is she needing her husband's support? Sorry. If she's needing her husband's support for commuting, that means she's dependent. But what about men leaders who are depending for entire all their household responsibilities on women? I mean, they can't cook their food, even in the food needs to be served. Actually, I used to work with a feminist social activist, well-known feminist, Vijay Srinivasan, and she used to say that Bihar mein ye paras ke khilana kya hota hai, which means serve. I'm like, food is ready, but you can't serve yourself. Somebody has to come, the woman has to come and serve, and then only you can eat. So this is the context, and I'm not saying that things have not changed. Things are changing. And I mean, like, feminist economists, economic historian like Nirmala Banerjee have been kind of emphasizing that as the gender relations undergo revision in course of development or culture, gender norms do change and reproductive behavior also change. And these transitions, I'm pretty sure that it impacts the conscious of men and women both. And we have seen that men are accepting it because men are not finding jobs, especially in states like Bihar. Mostly they are migrating. So in this context, what if the woman is getting a job as a frontline worker or as a panchayat leader? They are getting some support from the family. So definitely there is a change. But then these women panchayat leaders, I'm very sure, I don't know, I mean, I really wanted to hear more about your specific experience of Kerala, because I have worked partly on Jivika also, which is a livelihood promotion program in Bihar, somewhat like that. And I often hear from people that, why don't you compare from Kudumbashree? Why don't you learn from Kudumbashree? But I know the context is very, very, very different. But at the same time, I think probably, you might, throw some light on it that, I'll tell you, in case of Bihar, these women are facing kind of a double challenge. At one level, the patriarchal norms are there, which are kind of pushing them to reinvent patriarchy. I mean, it's rupturing patriarchy and at the same time pushing them to reinvent patriarchy. You can't completely deny it, but it is in a new form, maybe. For instance, if a woman panchayat leader is very active in her panchayat related work, probably her adolescent daughter will have to drop out from the school because she has to look after her younger siblings. So that kind of context. So that is one. And at the second level, as you rightly pointed out, and I really thank you for highlighting, the way the state is co-opting feminist ideologies, terminologies, it is scary. And now we have the concept of the NGO of the government. Jivika is a NGO of the government. So it's a so I mean, back in early 2000s and late 90s, women's organization used to operate as autonomous bodies. But now, especially with the beginning of this century, we are seeing a kind of wave of defaming NGOs and deglamorizing NGOs. And most of these, I think NGOs were the only space that provided some strength to poor women who especially worked on the rights for the poor women. But now nobody is talking about rights. Everybody is busy in production and selling the product. And at the same time, we have such a low female workforce participation. And I often quote that in Bihar, we have a Jivika since long back, like 2005-6. And the rural women's workforce participation in Bihar is 2.5%, which is very, 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 I don't know, it's a shame, I would say. So I was just thinking that, so there is this double pressure. At one level, the government is co-opting the entire idea of ideas and concepts and terminologies of feminist discourse, and at the same time there is patriarchy. And in this it's a chaotic atmosphere, and the chaos of this context is quite evident in the widening gender gap of India, I would say. because we are, I mean, we are going down rapidly. This gap is widening. So in that context, I really want to hear your opinion on how do you see that, how women are kind of, because I'll tell you from my experience, what I'm saying is that, yes, women are coming out, they are mobile, and they are kind of fulfilling those they're kind of, you know, helping us, you know, improving the gender development indicators that are mobile and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, if you look at how these women leaders are trying to change the gender norms or how they are helping women in their constituency, in many cases, we find that they are actually manifesting patriarchy, reinforcing patriarchy. I had shared in last discussion at IMPRI only that my recent study with elected women representative in Bihar shows that most of them were not comfortable with reporting, encouraging women to report the violence cases, the domestic violence cases to police, because that is supposed to be a stigma. I mean, they used to scare women that if you go to police and report, the police will come and there will be case and you will be in a financial trap, so it's not good for you and blah, blah, blah. So I'm just thinking that this is the context, and it's very, very, very important for us to think about it, because the gender gap is widening, and it is human development indicator, gender gap. Look at any indicator. It's widening, so it's very important to accept it, and also to think about what is the way out. What do you see in Kerala? How women are? I mean, how Kudumbashree really worked actually? You partly shared about it, but I would really like to hear more about your Kerala experience. Yeah, I think that's it from my side. Thank you again.
Thank you, Anamika. But I would have been liking more. Hello? I would have been liking you.
Yes,
if you would have been, yeah. I would have been liking if you would have pointed out as to how to really go about it, because patriarchy is reinventing yourselves in whichever form it is. Now, this is going on. Okay, fine. That statement is well taken. But then, what is that to be? What is to be done? How to really get out of this kind of a trap? It will go on manifesting again and again, different forms altogether. Now, how to go about it? What instrumentalities that one can think about to really go against this kind of a trend, and then reinvent and invent something which is very unique, innovative, and also at the same time make a fundamental change, this kind of what is called manifestation. Is it possible for us to think something of that kind?
Are you asking?
So your presentation is absolutely fascinating, but then you must really take yourself to that level of discourse. Is it possible for you to articulate something of that kind in this forum? Could you hear me, Anamika?
Sunilda, are you asking me or Dr. Binitha?
No, I am asking you because you made a point, very serious and important point. Take yourself to that level of discourse. And leave it to that. I mean, could you follow? Yeah.
Yeah, I could follow. I think I could follow what you asked. I think there are two things. One is very important, that we live in a market-based economy, and it is very important to recognize the economic contribution of women. If we do not recognize how she's contributing to the economy, and if we do not remunerate her economic contribution, it will be very difficult for us, for the society, to even respect her as an individual, even recognize her as a being who is worth of something. Right now, if we are not recognizing their labor, their economic contribution, we're actually denying their very existence in this market-based economy. They're kind of, I mean, they're easily disposable. And this is very clear from the Global Gender Gap report, which comes every year. And India is on, like, I think it's on 153rd position on the health and survival indicator. Out of 156 countries, we are on the 153rd position for health and survival, because we are not, this is my opinion, that we are not recognizing women's contribution. And for recognizing women's contribution, it is very important to design our tools, our statistical mechanism. For instance, UN is recognizing domestic work as an economic activity. UN is recognizing things done for personal work, personal consumption as economic activity. But our NSA is de-recognizing it. It is not recognizing domestic work or things that are done for personal consumption as economic activity. So that way we are kind of pushing many women out. We are just not recognizing them as workers. And then if you look at many work. For instance, a woman is yes, she's a domestic, she's looking after her domestic chores, but at the same time, if it is my MA thesis was on Bhagalpur silk spinners, and I used to see that how she would cook something, and then meanwhile she would come and spin thread, or maybe wash thread, or maybe prepare the loom, so that her husband could come and do the weaving. So they were constantly engaged in the entire day. They were working, but at the same time, when you ask them that, do you work? They used to say no. And that time, back in early 2000s, the concern was that women are not recognizing their labor. But right now, even the state is not ready to recognize their labor. And I think that is dangerous. That is devastating. Abhijit Sen and Jayati Ghosh and many other scholars have been talking about that, how it is. Jimo Lunne has been talking, Indira Hirave has been talking about that, how it is very, very, very important to recognize women's work and remunerate women's work. That is one point. And second, I think, is the way government has co-opted, was what Dr. Binitha has pointed out, the feminist ideas and terminologies and concepts. It has actually, we don't see autonomous women's organizations these days. We don't see women's organization at the grassroots talking about women's rights. We are kind of penalizing, pressurizing, and most of the NGOs now, back in late 90s or early 2000s, NGOs used to critique government. They used to kind of, there was kind of an opposition. They used to kind of compliment the government. But now we see that NGOs are working for the government. NGOs are helping government in promoting their program. If you look at Jivika Didis are right now engaged in open defecation campaign. They are engaged in alcohol prohibition campaign. I don't know when they will get time to, focus on their livelihood promotion program, which is the core agenda of Jivika. So these are some of the concerns. I mean, I could share only 2 points, but I'm sure Dr. Binitha will add more to it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Binitha. May I ask the same question later on, not now? Later, the rest of the discussion finish their presentation, and then later on, I may ask the same question as to how to really get out of this kind of thing. State-sponsored NGOs. Well done, well spoken, but that is the story. Now the question is that how to get out. Is it that you are trying to promote, you are trying to suggest that autonomous women's organizations should be really flourish more and more everywhere? Is it that you are trying to talk about? You have to be explicit in your what is called recommendations or thinking, taking your argument further, to a kind of a resolution. Unless it is there at that for years and years and years. So that's one thing. So maybe that I may ask the same question, may request Binitha to enlighten somebody like me who is searching for some answer for that. Okay, next, the discussion, may I, yeah. Now, you can add later on. Do you want to speak right now? Okay, speak.
No, I just think that when you say that be very specific, we want to have a resolution, we need to be, we need to take cognizance of the context, and it is a chaotic context, it is a messy context, and the state is churning, and I don't think that we will have a very clear prescription for coming out of it. And we feel handicapped also because the context is very problematic. The state is not, the state's priorities are very different. At one level, we see more women representatives in panchayat and local governing bodies, but at the same time, the kind of work they are engaged in, are these priorities what they are supposed to do? Is it going to help them in, promoting gender equality and all?
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. I think that is the point which need to be further discussed. And Binitha, maybe Dr. Binitha may be able to enlighten us on that point. But let us stop at that, and let me turn to the second discussion, Dr. Aditya. Dr. Aditya Mohanty. Thank you, Anamika. Thank you so much for making a very, very concrete and interesting points that you made. Certainly is very contributory in furthering the discussions on this issue on women. Okay, next, Dr. Aditya. Would you like to, Dr. Binitha, do you like to respond to Dr. Anamika's questions or whatever?
No, I'll do it together.
Together. That's very good. Very good. Okay, fine. Dr. Aditya? Dr. Aditya, may I request you to make your points?
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, good.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you, Professor Ray, for this opportunity to give my remarks to Professor Binitha's presentations. I also thank my co-panelists, especially Anamika, for this provocative remarks to begin with, and Arun for giving me an opportunity to be part of this exciting event. I'll try to, keeping the constraints of time in mind, I'll try to keep my observations limited to two in nature, one at a conceptual plane and one at a policy plane. First and foremost, Dr. Binitha, I think that, of course, I mean, to begin with, that your presentation had this excellent critical textbookish, shift from wid, wad, gad, and where you really, even if for someone who did not know anything about gender, like me, who never worked in gender, but something else, it was a quite, it was a good ground to begin with the people. So basically what you draw home is the point that, well, there is a shift in vocabulary from equity to empowerment to intersectionality finally. And I think from there, I will take it forward. I work on questions of participatory urban governance, especially as a researcher. And so drawing analytical parallels, what I feel that the question of gender mainstreaming is definitely lost the moment we keep on clamoring about the fact that women need to be kept as, asserted as different creatures, or to say that the bandwagon has to be completely women-centric or feminist-centric, so on and so forth, because that's the way, then it gets entirely defeated the whole purpose for what gender mainstreaming is all about. It is not about bringing about another, bandwagon of the women-only campaign. The whole idea that is, of course, being reiterated here is that when you have a development model that talks about taking women as a separate category, the system fails, because then already women are victimized as agents by the agents of patriarchy, and now they again develop more complexes for others because they feel that the pie is being shared only by the women. So that gives them more enemies. So of course that's so at a very colloquial level, I would say that of course GAD is what we should be discussing, and that's how you've been very interestingly putting up the questions of intersectionality that is coming out of the GAD program. But then Anamika brings this I would say, a very meaty political economic question that in spite of all of that, what about the female work participation rate? I mean, that's where the real game begins. That you cannot have a gongo, which Aradhana Gupta and others talk about, that government organized, non-government organizations, or what you talked about, which I found that a very funny oxymoron, state organized civil society. I mean, the moment it is state organized, then what is civil and what is society about it left in it? The moment it is state organized civil society. But be that as it may, with this entire Gongo program, what has happened is, what Anamika again told was that it is about this co-optation of this entire drive, where you expected women to be handheld to begin with, and then make them autonomous agents. But I think the reason why it really doesn't work now is that somewhere down the line, we are forgetting a parallel economic condition that we are grappling with. And I would take to recourse to the writings of this amazing writer, Judith Butler's idea of precarity, where she excellently brings out, this is a very recent work, maybe a decade back, 2004, where she says that we need to distinguish between precariousness as an ontological condition and precarity as a politically induced condition. So,
very good.
It's a very incisive remark in this context, where women might have been born as vulnerable entities within a given system, but then the moment you say them, well, you guys line up and join as SHGs, then that's the ticket of being empowered. That's where you make them precarity as a very, signposting them as empowered citizens in this way. And then the second thing then, but what then finally comes out here is that can't women really come to the mainstream through any other detouring it through non-SHG modes? Can't they really come up as entrepreneurs in their own right? can't women and men collaborate and come up with enterprises? I mean, some very, questions which we can really work out at a micro level. And I think a solution for that, I mean, I really do not know a lot about Kudumbashri, but whatever I've read from works of course, Devika has been really phenomenal in her writings of Kudumbashri, appending the sociological angle to the economic aspects of Kudumbashri. But what really, with Kudumbashri, there's a problem of replication across, because you have a regime of socialization there, where you very well tell that there is a literacy campaign that goes on in society, and it's a very gender sensitive society that can talk about a campaign where you can talk about appending PRIs to SHGs, which is very, I think, half of the UP Bihar belt will faint the moment you talk about telling PRIs getting attached to SHGs already given that. So that's of course, so there is, I think that Kudumbashri has its limitations because it has got some, supply side reservations which demand side doesn't understand. So you already have things in place. So now what I think, rather, I would take, this will be my final point to my remarks, that I think Jivika of late has come up with something very interesting, which Abhijit Banerjee has been doing. Of course, it has its limitation, but still I find some meat in it, where they've started this targeting the ultra poor. And that came in the wake of this, it technically told that it comes up as a very welfareist program, that they're targeting the ultra poor, but that was basically a political, step to, compensate for people who were quitting, drinking habits and prohibition and all that. So I think that there is, when you talk about targeting the ultra poor, you take this entire initiative beyond the feminist lenses and say that, well, you can be ultra poor, even if you are a man or a woman, doesn't matter, then you can again come into the fold. But then, as you again told, that first you have to show your identity cards as having the passport of being a SHG member first, or a GVK member, and then you are a part of the ultra poor or not. So I think that to conclude, my remarks would be this, that gender mainstreaming in this country can be better, provided of course, we need to move away from the anti-poverty reduction strategy schemes that you have already pointed out, that we cannot see women welfare programs as another anti-poverty alleviation strategies. But two, what instead we should do is, one, that we need to understand, we need to go for definitely maybe a large scale baseline survey of finding out that
slowly
find out as to who are the other precarious, or say for that time, vulnerable citizens within a community, irrespective of the gender, make a targeting of them, and maybe then put them into stratas and devise targeted programs for, dole out some kind of a program where they can be brought into the mainstream. But apart from that, however, as we say that here, that whole question of intersectionality has to be kept in mind, because even if you can, the one lenses can put different categories together as being economically vulnerable, there might again be differences of, as you say, racial or cultural ethnicity or affinities, by which certain two types of seemingly similar poor people cannot be brought together. So I think that gender mainstreaming in the country, it's a long way to go now, but we won't be, pessimistic. Kudumbashri can lead the way, but I think we have to break the silos. We need to break the silos. This won't work. Neither, I would say that neither really, that entire obsession with revival of the feminist paradigm and not letting it to be co-opted by the state, or even the insecurity of the patriarchs to patronize the women via the state, because that's what they have basically done in SHG. The moment they found that these women are becoming are blooming up as independent voices, let's try to patronize them and let the subalterns speak what we want them to speak in another way. So with that, I'll keep my observations. I think that you can reflect on some of the issues that I've raised up. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Aditya. So nice after a long time. I really liked some of your points, but before Dr. Binitha respond to Aditya's points that he raised, I may ask a question to Aditya, maybe that the same thing Binitha can respond to. It's basically an attempt on my part to enlighten myself. I do not know much about it. Only thing that my confusion is here, extra institutional structure. You go for construction for extra institutional structure, like Kudumbashri, for example, or through panchayat, something of that kind. And on the one hand, that is for empowerment of women. The objective is basically is that. But at the same time, taking a woman as a separate category, as you said very rightly, is a failure in certain cases, the majority of the cases. That being the case, now I would like to see the efficacy. I like to understand the efficacy of constructing the extra institutional structure to see that, this gender mainstreaming is something which could be possible. So the lessons to be drawn from here is that structural analysis. How do you really enter yourself? How do you enter through this road to the structural analysis for restructuring the society, to restructure the relationship between the men and women, between the people from one and different across the section, across gender, across race. Okay, so implications from what I understand from you and of course Anamika together, that this restructuring structure, maybe the extra institutional structure, need to have a greater understanding, a deeper understanding, its efficacy in the light of what happens practically. Because what Anamika said very nicely is, you find continuously what is called reinvention of patriarchy. Now, in the light of this fact that there is patriarchy, which has been even Kudumbisri, even the Binitha's presentation, you find despite all these kind of interventions, you find the reinvention of what is called this one, the reinvention of this patriarchy, and which is stalling the process of change which is being desired. That being the case, now if you respond in a one line, and then Dr. Binitha will be able to really do extensively on this one. Now, Dr. Aditya, the question pointedly asks you this, what is called extra institutional structure.
Yes, I think that it goes without saying that, of course, when we are talking about identifying both categories of men and women together into this program, we are talking about extra institutional structures. We're not talking about only state-sponsored institutional structures, because if we do that, then we will get back into the same problem of the tyranny of participation, which people have already talked about. That the
forget about that.
Yeah. So I think that when we talk about extra institutional structures, the reason why we should talk about extra institutional structures, I think, are twofold. One, there is a certain chance that the question of intersectionality provides. The moment, because these are questions of intersectionality definitely comes to the fore,
absolutely,
you will get more takers. So maybe an NGO who is interested in environmental campaigns would then find women also equally lucrative as their clients or their respondents, and vice versa. So if that fact, the moment you have extra institutional structures opened up, you're basically letting more people participate, and I would say that mutual interest can be really harped upon. One second thing why I think institutional structures would also be important is because of what we have already seen in the case of Jivika, which Anamika very rightly points out, that a state which already has a program of a decade and a half into its running still fails to get real-time changes in the indexes of female workforce participation. So I think that there is no denying the fact that extra institutional structures would be relevant, of course. But I think at the same time, extra institutional structures would also be relevant because the state-led programs generally end up to be very, I would do a lot of lip glossing and just giving them not entitlements or any capability enhancement, but do a very, cosmetic change in terms of living. Maybe the institutional structures will have, because they, of course, more money would also go into these programs because you have 3 sets of training campaigns coming up, and that will be equally lucrative for our partners or civil society actors as well. But then at the end of the day, the money is pushed, but at least some residues are remaining back. So extra institutionals, of course, is important for these 2-3 reasons that I've outlined. Yes, sir.
Good. Thank you so much. Thank you, Aditya. Now, Dr. Binitha, this is your turn. Then, before you discuss or respond to their queries or the questions, whatever it is, I have a very small question to you, and then you can incorporate my point of view. I was wondering, when I was hearing you, patriarchal structure, I want to know from you, where does this patriarchal structure intersect with market values or the market system or this capitalist market economy? Where do they interact with each other? Intersection point, number one. And related to that, I just want to know from you, with reference to your first part of your study, is that, this areas of conflict and convergence, the patriarchy and the market value. Patriarchal value, market value. Now, there could be some areas of convergence. There should be the areas of conflict. Now, convergence, I understand, but the conflict and how these conflicts are being resolved, and that's through the reinvention of what's called patriarchal values, the domination of the market. The market values accommodates continuously, these patriarchal values for its own benefit. So if that is the case, there is no conflict between the two. Can you please enlighten us on these points? I don't know whether my questions are right or wrong, but then this is what I felt after hearing you. I thought I must ask you very honestly. So, Dr. Binitha, now, God is with you. Yes.
Yes, Mr. Ray, we also have Simi, and she also have some questions. So, Dr. Binitha, would you like to also collect those? Or
Would
like
that be okay if I come in now, sir? Professor Ray?
Sorry, I mean, there are many.
No issues. Sorry, sir. Is it okay if I come in now, or I can come in later?
No, please go ahead now.
In the interest of time, it would be good. So that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Thampi, and to all the panelists and Professor Ray. So I have very quick points to make about the fact that gender mainstreaming has theoretically been framed as a noble framework for action. However, we have seen that despite efforts, gender mainstreaming has not attained the desired results for the transformation, the gender transformation and social change. I believe that the major reason for this has been the bureaucratic interference to appropriate mainstreaming at the expense of social transformation. Please provide your viewpoints on this, ma'am. And also the focus has been on administrative and fiscal reforms rather than while neglecting to consider the ways in which institutions can better support the women and address the accountability failures. So this is my first point. And second point is that the most critical element of mainstreaming, that mainstreaming in operations has not yet been attained or attempted, because implementation has mostly focused on internal organizational dimensions like staffing, policies, developing indicators, training of all staff, etc., which are often interpreted as preconditions to interventions at operational level. But once we come to the operational level, then everything becomes diluted. So in order to ensure a cohesive development, the broad framework of this talk, what must be considered? I mean, for example, can changes at the operational level will or will not improve the lives of the men and women? Will concrete actions or concrete results in terms of increased development effectiveness, would it constitute a way forward in the current impasse that we are faced with? And which ultimately will lead to the empowerment goals. So these are my quick points, ma'am, and respected panelists. If you'd like to respond, it is, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simi. Very nice points that you have made. Yes, very interesting, quite stimulating. Next, anybody?
So that's it. I think we can go to.
No, anybody else is there?
No, I think Dr. Thampi can go on. Then I can ask some policy schemes related questions after that, but that will be more of applied. So, Dr. Thampi, why not?
Yeah, I'm exercising my freedom to avoid some of the comments and questions and select some of them. This is what I regularly do.
Please, yes.
Reason is sometimes I may completely dismiss some of the questions. Sometimes I need more time to think on some of them. Sometimes they are not questions per se, some kind of broader reflections, comments, and all that. I might agree with them. So because of all these reasons, I selectively pick your questions. Well, I start with Anamika's point. Decontextualization, depoliticization, dehistoricization. Yeah, I argued for one, history of the location is important because I worked with a historian, J. Deviga, for a long time, wrote together And I learned the value of history. So the history of the location matters, because even these several policies and programs, even Kudumbashri, another paper I did, I published in Geoforum, not with Devika, somebody else, was actually looking at Kudumbashri working very differently in two locations, wherein one location, the CPM, the Communist Party, is very strong and rigidly controlling Kudumbashri, whereas in the other location, it's not. So even programs, intentions may be same, but it's unfolding differently, working differently in different locations. So that location, its history, contextualizations are important. I agree with you. And your question and your comment on women's studies in India, that's an entirely different failure of women's studies program in India. Anandi and...
I was not talking about women's studies in India. I was talking about Western countries.
Yeah, I'll come back to that, interestingly. So in India, it's a failure. And even in the West, if you look at, it has changed very significantly. For my Fulbright 3 years ago, I've been to a women's studies program in Rutgers University. Now the program has been repacked. It's more gender and sexuality studies, so it's changing well, but I agree with you. And the other question, you talked about the quota. That was the point you raised. The way in which quotas reservation has been institutionalized and the proxy argument. Mary John has come up with a very interesting paper on these proxy argument, in which, see, this is about power. How long somebody else will control you, and you will use it at some point when you have it. And I've seen that in the context of Kerala, wherein women were using it unknowingly or unanticipating the consequences of it, and and that has put them in a very difficult kind of situations. We did field work, me and Devika, and Subhan published a book, Gender Paradoxes of Political Decentralization. We did around 160 interviews with women in local governance. So proxy has been perhaps dismissed, I would say. That's what I've seen in the context of Kerala. And I looked at 3 terms, 15 years, women in local governing institutions, what's happening. Also, what I found basically was a group becoming more acceptable locally, which party cannot do anything after a while, because they're gaining support locally, and party has to do accommodation, so. And also another group completely moved out, and yet another group gained some sort of skills and management abilities, and they used it elsewhere, got into some good employment. So outcome, if you look at, of this induction of women into local governance is very varied. Another group became, another group actually, they came from Kudumbashri's structure. So they were sort of continuing that, whatever they brought in. So it's very interesting mix if you look at. Our book discusses at length all these different groups and categories of women and the kind of outcome. Then the question of reinventing patriarchy, I am not very, very comfortable with that term reinventing, because patriarchy has always been there. It's repacking, and patriarchy is also changing, and also new repackaging takes place. Sometimes it's getting more advantageous for women, sometimes not. So that's how it is changing. Yes, patriarchy is changing significantly. So it's not like reinventing the wheel. It has been there. And the question is, why do they do that sometimes? Again, the Dennis Candiotti's work collaborating with patriarchy, it's advantageous for women to collaborate with patriarchy, right? So why do they fight unnecessarily? At least when you become old, you get some respect and you can exercise power, right? So they call it as, in politics, they call it as honorary masculinity is given to you, you know, more respect, so on and so forth. That's one point. Second, you talked about, you said my experience of Kudumba Shri, in the sense, my fieldwork experience of women in Kudumba Shri. See, I am not basically against, you know, Kudumba Shri or linking it with the local governing structure. It has got its own advantage. It gave women some sort of respectability locally. They are accessing local political power centers, their connection. It's also, men are not objecting it because they want that channel to be open. Women are actually the conduit for those transfers, welfare transfers, and respect transfers as well locally. So that's why women are there with the Kudumba Shri more than half of the household in the state. They want to be part of the Kudumba Shri. But when it comes to the work participation question you brought in, why low work participation in Bihar, female participation, and in Kerala also it's very relatively low. NSSO data, it's not NSSO anymore, it's annual. So it's around 25%, but then also the self-employment via Kudumba Shri program, I have sort of discomfort with that, because what they actually do, the income that's actually been generated is very, very less. And there is no division between profit and wages. Whatever they get, they divide it within the group.
That's right.
So which is, you can argue that this is better than nothing, but also that is not advantageous for all kinds of women. So you also find women get excluded from this and they get into wage labor, so on and so forth. Also, a couple of years ago in Colombo, there was a demonstration by self-help group women in which the demand slogan basically was that we don't need microfinance anymore. Give us employment, decent employment. So this is being acknowledged by researchers in Asia and Africa. If you look at self-employment is worse than casual wage labor. So that's something we need to keep in mind. Why unemployment and low employment opportunities is a broader, larger question. It has to do with the way in which India has developed over a long period of time and the kind of policies we adopted differently in different locations within the national policy framework. There are various studies and arguments. That's a different area altogether, but also interestingly, during the period of economic growth in India, 2005, 2013, 14 period, if you look at employment in formal sector for women declined. That was something researchers have looked at and came up with various explanatory hypotheses. I'm not getting into that. That's it, I think, about your comments. And then coming back to what should be Professor Sunil Ray's comment. It's a very, very difficult question, but I would like to engage with that. The question is, what would you suggest to completely demolish patriarchy? If that is the question, how do we understand patriarchy? The argument basically is that patriarchy is the kind of social division created in the history, even before, in the history before history, even before any other forms of class-based or any other forms of social divisions came up. All of the social divisions modeled the patriarchy, used as a model, and made divisions and stratification. This is the argument a group of feminists came up with. So what is that policy that you suggest right now that can do away with patriarchy is not very helpful for us to deal the situation. I can give you one example. The time use survey data came out very recently in India. So we had a sample survey 20 years ago, and what was very striking was the difference in time allocation between men and women in household production hasn't changed in this country in the past 20 years. So a journalist friend of mine wrote on Facebook that this is surprising. Even in Kerala, you will see the change. My response was that yes, if you start doing the household work from tomorrow onwards, and many other people are doing, this will change in the coming 20 years. That's it. It's very simple. So the point basically is, it's actually asking a kind of radical transformation in the way in which we divide our household responsibilities and work, the way in which our institutions are structured. And it's omnipresent, it's there everywhere. So that kind of a change we need. Question hence is, can the state bring in change? The Simi's question basically was also that why it's failing, gender mainstreaming is failing in terms of bringing in changes. Tell me social and cultural changes state cannot bring in to a greater extent. It can facilitate through, say, some kind of policies and programs. And this is not a communist state like China, communist or not, I don't know. But then the controls are different. China's one-child policy, if you look at, China could do that because of the way in which the state is functioning. You can't have more children. We don't have that kind of, we have democracy and more kind of freedom, and households are as microcosmic units located within and responding to those larger structures. So the change has to happen at every level, individual level and community level and institutional level and state level and so on and so forth. That's why it's taking centuries, and this has happened over a long period of time, centuries of patriarchy and repackaging of patriarchy. And collaboration, women and other groups, men are also collaborating. Disadvantages men. Men have many disadvantages. Poor men working in informal sector labor, they also, this is a kind of survival question, right? So this collaboration, accommodation also taking place. So there's no point in us getting frustrated and happy to understand and slowly move forward. That's something I would suggest. And what can be done immediately in terms of policies, if you are looking at several things can be done. For instance, the infrastructure imagination. Anamika talked about women's labor question, recognizing, and I have my position on that is slightly different. In the recent state assembly elections, Kamala Hassan started with this wages for housework, and even the left government and the Congress party announced kind of wages and pension for women and all that. I think that's not a good solution. It rather reproduces women's role as the division of labor, it reinforces. Okay, women are doing this job, let them do it forever, which is not a good solution. Rather, I would suggest make it formal, decent employment, childcare at the local level, childcare centers, elderly care centers, good wages for women, they will do happily. And also a fair sharing of household work between men and women. And that for that, there is a kind of cultural change has to happen, which is very, very hard. Also, the question of female feticide, infanticide in this country, we had very strict rules and policies and all that. Look at the data, 91, 2001, 2011, it's happening. So the state cannot regulate certain things that easily. It's a matter of social and cultural change. Policy-wise, infrastructure imagination, if you look at, which you see very, very distinct form of infrastructure prioritization and imagination in this country. Plug in gender concerns within certain infrastructure, better transportation, commutation facilities, childcare centers, so on and so forth, will enhance women's workforce participation. So it can be, and taxation policy for those who pay the tax, women-friendly taxation policy. Gender macroeconomics group have come up with very interesting set of policies, but state is not that happy implementing them. Then the new efficacy of extra-institutional arrangements. Yeah, point is you can come up with any kind of institutional structures and arrangements, but who will ensure the efficacy of them? That's the question. So again, then the other point that you said, why do I talk about autonomous women's organizations and bringing, see, there is history in the West. When Donald Trump assumed power in the United States, women's organization calls for a demonstration. In 2016, I was there, and I've seen large number of men and women participating and protesting and demonstrations, so on and so forth, rescuing their democracy. And women's groups have had a history in that location to invite people for protest and talk to them. They had a language and talk to them like we need to save democracy. And they've been doing that throughout his time. So the point is such collectivization of women across caste class lines in this country is needed everywhere. It's needed. That's what I believe. Also, hence my criticism basically in Kerala also, women's movement is not doing anything, finding fault with state and Kudumbashri and all that, they do whatever they can, but they can, women's movement has to be more vibrant and reorganize and be more vibrant and responsive to the state and its institutions, critically engage with the state and its institutions, which they could not. And even in the Sabrimala protest and all that entry of women into Sabrimala, women's movement could not do anything, whereas the state did. And that is a huge political risk for them, but they did. Yeah, that's it. Also, Dr. Aditya's question. See, this victimization was 70s, 80s, and then that's why I argued for difference feminism. So even in the within the state feminism that has been acknowledged, recognized, not being treating, women are not being treated as victims of development or patriarchy or whatever. State organized or state initiated civil society, that's a kind of calling Kudumbashri as, because you actually see the presence of state and its party there in Kudumbashri, but it is a civil society organization. Qualitatively, it's different. That's why I used, Devika also used that state organized or state initiated, state support civil society. I'm not commenting on your Butler's precariousness and precarity, that differentiation. I just have to think about it. You talked about, because Butler, we need to be very careful with Butler. As someone who is failing in the classroom to convince students about gender trouble, I just have to be more attentive to that. But you talked about detours. What are the possible detours that women can have, which one has to do an extensive field work and document? There may be detours and success stories, and to by reflecting on those detours and successes, we need to come up with a formulation, which I cannot do at the moment because I don't have stories. And the ultra poor, you refer the bottom two in Kerala's policy framework. If you look at that, bottom two destitutes, they have, because they try to, we need to understand the source of poverty, maybe unwell, illness, or some disability. There are various reasons for that poverty. They cannot act and come out of poverty. Destitute groups, they are being called as destitutes. And there is a kind of specific policies and programs for them. Even during this COVID time, there are community kitchens and food supplies and all that for them. Elderly people, for instance, those who are having no other support and they are old. So we don't have a social pension and all that, right? So, and your other point, interesting. I agree with you. Anti-poverty efforts from empowerment and yeah, I agree. But the difficulty basically is this is a state's program, and that has a different history also, because 80s onwards, if you're untying, what are the claims of women like me and Anamika? It's not a poverty question. It's equity, equality question, symbolic and material, right? And this is very, very hard for policy circles to accept. That's one thing. And on the other hand, all said and done, addressing poverty is the primary responsibility of the state. So I could actually see the logic behind doing that. And also among state governments, if you look at, there is a more support for such tying up anti-poverty with women's empowerment. And your question of new forms of poverty, I agree. We did a study and published in Geoforum. New forms of poverty are actually emerging. Kerala, I've seen that. Newer vulnerabilities and newer forms. Farmers, for instance, after the period of farmer suicides, and they have assets, but no income at their disposal. So there are new categories, several such categories we identified, and we looked at new forms of poverty emerging, which is qualitatively different from traditional forms of poverty, vulnerability question. So some of your points, I agree. These are my comments. And another major point, the final collaboration between patriarchy and the market forces, capitalism. You look at the labor market, don't you see that? Why there is a wage differential for the same amount of work? Why is it that majority of the NRBGP workers are women? So it's not just in the formal, or not just in the private sector employment. You will find that everywhere. Labor market very, very effectively, domestic work, labor is exploitation. Why do they do that? We all exploit them. They don't get fair wages. And we are not actually legislating, even though ILO was insisting, pushing for legislation for domestic workers. The draft bill is ready, but we are not acting on it. So we do that very clearly, very efficiently. I have several examples if you ask me. So you see that everywhere, and also more importantly, the advertisements and commodifying women and so on and so forth. Also the market using patriarchal values and women as a kind of commodity, constructing certain kinds of femininity, and ultimately consumption for both men and women. All right. So there are various ways in which capitalism is appropriating. So we can think about, actually, we can think about, I think in the sense we can even imagine about anything except post-capitalist world. We don't know what it looks like. So such is the power of that. So even now, because of the anxiety of climate change and things of that sort, people started reflecting and working, but it's not bringing in. Even Greta Thunberg's attack on state governments, Emmanuel Macron was very apologetic, and his response was interesting. He said, that's not in my hands, not in our hands. It's with corporations. So we cannot reduce the temperature as various forums decide within a stipulated period of time. It's not a state decision, basically. So that's how it's going. I'll wrap up here. Thank you all.
Dr. Arjun? Dr. Arjun, do you have? Dr. Arjun?
Yes, sir. I'm here.
Yeah. Could you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. You have something, to ask or to discuss.
So, sir, I think ma'am has really summed up. I really wanted to ask what are the views of ma'am of the flagship program of the government, like Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao, and other efforts by the state governments. How contextually she sees the difference between different regions of India. That was one of my concern coming out from the policy level. That was my question. If Professor Thampi.
Very good.
I'm sorry, I'm not commenting on those programs because I haven't done enough work on them. Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao program, I read a few papers, but I'm not a person to comment on various programs of the national government and state government. I've looked at some of them. Based on that, I can comment, but I won't be able to. For instance, NREGA, there is a body of literature documented. These programs, several other scholars studied. I haven't studied them in detail. And that too, it's a very, very broad area of work, like in several programs and several of the central government and the various state governments. I won't get into, we won't open that Pandora's box. And I'm also not qualified enough to respond to each of them. Thank you.
No, I was really asking that question as an economist because time and again, even in the elections now, we see that Tamil Nadu is proposing that we give 1,500, 2,000 per month to housewives. And there is so many plethora of issues now for especially the Bimaru state or now districts. We are focusing on aspirational district or Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. So the direction, or I would say acceleration in terms of different intervention, there is sharp regional direction. So in that aspect, I really thought to gain some insight from you. And Tamil Nadu really leads in many of them. So that is why I asked that question. Anyhow, so over to you, Professor Ray, to summarize and conclude the proceeding for today. Yes.
If anybody else is there to raise, if not nobody else is there, then I would like to conclude.
Yes.
I must thank Dr. Binitha for a very stimulating presentation of the issues that on related to gender mainstreaming. It's very interesting in many ways. I do not want to sum up, that's something which is self-explanatory, but I thank, because most of the questions that being issues or questions being raised by many of us, you have pointedly attended and responded to each one. Whether one agrees or not, but then is very concerted attempt is there on your part to respond them as appropriately as you can, which really has been very interesting and quite learning for everyone. So I must really appreciate that one. Another one is that the discussant, Dr. Anamika and Dr. Aditya, their participation and the kind of issues they have raised are equally important and very stimulating. I must thank them for having participated very fruitfully, effectively, and also generating a considerable amount of debate and discussion, which if it is allowed to be continued, perhaps one can dwell upon these issues further. But then that is how what the purpose of this seminar is all about. And the root is nothing but the presentation of Dr. Binitha. Having said that, I must thank all of you and, for this particular series to be successful. I mean, it's a continuous process, but this is a part of it. And therefore, I must say it does certainly adds value to the entire process. Finally, let me just make a very small, very brief comment on Binitha's presentation to conclude. It may not be a substantive one, but could be an indicative one. The purpose for which this series is being, I'm trying to let the presentation, the major message, the most interesting message or important message that I could draw from it, and that could be related to the purpose for which this series is being, initiated by Dr. Arjun. The relationship between that what we're talking about and what is finally is going to be there. It's too difficult for one to really depicture what is going to happen tomorrow. But definitely it is possible for us to really to look through, to see through what is probably going to happen. And that is where, for example, the state as an institution that we talked about, despite the fact that recently I came across a paper written by a friend of mine by Chotokulam, you must be knowing, Jose Chotokulam in Mainstream. That's a very interesting, he's a very good friend of mine. He sent the copy immediately after the publication. And that is again, in Kerala, the women's positions related to elections and all that taking place. Despite all these changes taking place, despite the fact that macro policies have been extensively adopted as compared to other states, you find, and also Kudumbashree is one of the unique inventions on the part of the government of Kerala. And you do see a good amount of mobilization of women. Despite all that, still you find what Anamika spoke about is something reinvention of the patriarchy in some form or the other. That is something, Thomas Chotokulam's paper does reflect upon. Now the point is that at one point of time you said, which he really liked, collectivization of women. And as they get the male and women, you have given some example for other countries. So men and women together, a kind of a systemic, what is called a change of relation, a different kind of social institution that you can conceive about. And that should be built up based on the forces of solidarity between male and female. That is the end of the day. And something which cannot be ignored, it cannot be minimized, it cannot be underestimated. Without that, you really would not be able to bring about a kind of a change. I am just forcing my argument onto your model of thinking. I'm trying to relate myself. Where do you have to go? It's something which is a kind of trajectory of change. I know that a friend of mine, Naila Kobi, once told me when he's in Sussex, he told me, Sunil, why are you hurrying up? Everything is in gradual process. I said, totally agree with you. Evolution through the gradualization process, I do agree. So changes take place. This is 2 decades, 3 decades ago. Now this goes on. Of course, 3 decades ago, what the status or the situation between male and female or the issues that being these to be raised regarding the gender was different from today. Today, certainly different, is much more improved. But how much really change has taken place is certainly something which needs to be counted, which certainly should be counted. And therefore, I do agree, everything is in process of change, has to take place because 2 countervailing forces, 2 contradictory forces had to resolve their contradiction, has to have a synthesis at some level. And this synthesis is something evolutionary process which cannot be what is called discounted. It has to take place, maybe 100 years after, but that's a different story. But I'm saying that bringing that one process of change is something, and where this collectivization, that is the kind of suggestion that you're making, and this collectivization has to really have a base on the forces of solidarity between male and female, is something that cannot be discounted. And perhaps that gives us a kind of a indication for a new trajectory to come up. What is called a solution to really think about. Not that I'm saying that a solution, a kind of 1 + 1 = 2, nothing of that kind, but definitely some positive indications of that kind has to be there. And we, the researchers, have a responsibility to really think about, to really think, to really jot down, to really think very seriously. There are some scholars, I mean, outside the country, they have been writing on very, very emphatically as to how to go about and all that. Where, in fact, I'm forgetting the names of some authors, they have spoken about what that you are indirectly talking about collectivization is nothing but the mobilization of the forces of the women through the spirit is something which is very important for us to really look about. And I think with these words, may not be the words from an expert, definitely, but certainly an observer. And I feel more, I would like to conclude by saying that I feel more enlightened by Dr. Binitha's presentation, and of course the discussion, issues being raised by the discussion by Dr. Anamika and our friend Dr. Aditya. Something this is very stimulating, and I think Dr. Arjun will be very happy that in the kind of objective that he has set is going to be fulfilled by this series of presentations that's being made. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Arjun.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Thampi, Dr. Thampi, you have some parting words? Are you able to hear me? Would you like to have some parting words? Yeah.
Is it to me?
Yes.
No. I had an interesting conversation with some of you. So some of the questions that you raised and kind of comments and concerns, I take with me, think about, reflect in other forums. And this is how it happens, right? We collectively learn together and such interactions and engages. Otherwise, usually I'm in the classroom talking to students. That is also quite energizing experience. So thank you for this invitation and very interesting set of comments and suggestions. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. So with that, I would really like to thank all of you for attending this very pertinent discussion under our series, The State of Development Discourses, #Cohesive Development with Prof Sunil Ray. And today's discussion on critical evaluation of gender mainstreaming efforts by the state by Dr. Binitha Thampi, ma'am. Thank you so much. And I would say it was really a detailed and what we ought to desire to have this extensive discussion. So I'm really thankful to our chair, Professor Sunil Ray. And I must really say that the discussants for today, Dr. Simon Mehta, Dr. Anamika, and Dr. Mohanty really added up to a lot for, I think, those who would be watching the video now and even later. It was very stimulating, and I hope we would keep learning more and more, and also learn in future also by Dr. Thampi and all of you. So with that, I wish you best of health, and please take care of yourself. Have a good evening. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ray. Thank you, Binitha ma'am. Thank you, Anamika ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks a ton.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you all. Bye. Bye, Anamika.
Thank you. We should talk.
Yeah.
I had 2 points, but I will take later.
I will share number. I will exchange numbers.
Sure.
Thank you.